Welcome to Underline This podcast, the podcast where we unpack the big ideas hiding in the margins. Because the best parts, they're between the lines. In 1741, a British warship vanished into the most unforgiving waters on Earth. What followed was mutiny, madness, cannibalism, and a courtroom battle over who deserved to be called a hero or a villain. Today we're diving into The Wager, a story that asks, what does morality look like when civilization appears? And it talks about the moment survival rewrites right and wrong. A lot of this comes down to power. And I want to talk about a scene from Game of Thrones that I thought of and as I was reading The Wager. And it's a parable as Lord Varys is sitting down with Tyrion Lannister. And in the parable, he says, in a room sit three great men, a king, a rich man, and a priest. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword to kill the other two. Then he asks who lives and who dies. When Tyrion hears this, he answers incorrectly, and Varys presses him with the main point, which is that power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall. And he goes on to explain, and I guess, again, this is a paraphrase, that power really isn't a fixed thing, like strength or birthright. It's a collective belief, almost an illusion, maintained because people agree to it. A king, a priest, or a wealthy man only has power as long as others believe they do, which is why perception, stories, and loyalty matter more than force alone. So power is a social construct, not an absolute truth. And that is very, very much related to the story of The Wager, because it's about authority and when authority begins to just dissolve. So we're going to break this book down with a summary, background of the author, the historical context, key themes, and underlying quotes and ideas. Kick things off, let's provide you with a summary. So The Wager tells the true story of an 18th century British naval expedition that descends into catastrophe and then into something even more unsettling, the battle over truth itself. In 1741, the HMS Wager, part of a larger British fleet sent to challenge Spanish power, was wrecked off the coast of Patagonia. Now the survivors are stranded in a hostile, remote landscape with little food, collapsing leadership, and no clear path home. And what follows is not merely a survival story, but a slow erosion of order. Discipline fractures, loyalty splinter, and moral lines blur as hunger and fear take control. Now, years later, two competing groups of survivors return to England, each telling radically different versions of what happened. One account frames the captain as a tyrant and justifies mutiny. The other incites authority was necessary and rebellion unforgivable. Now, the British Admiralty must decide whom to believe, knowing the verdict will shape careers, reputations, and national myths. Now, at its core, The Wager is not about a shipwreck. It's about who gets to define reality when power, survival, and narrative collide. We're going to talk about David Grann and why he wrote this book. So David Grann is an acclaimed American journalist and nonfiction author, best known for transforming real historical events into gripping, narrative-driven stories that read like novels without sacrificing factual rigor. Grann is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he spent years producing deeply researched long-form journalism. His reporting often uncovers forgotten histories, moral ambiguities, and hidden crimes, blending investigative journalism with immersive storytelling. Many of his magazine articles later expand into best-selling books. Now, some of his most notable books are The Lost City of Z, an exploration of obsession, exploration, and the mystery of vanished Amazonian civilizations. One that a lot of people are familiar with, I know I am. I've seen the movie and read the book, and that is The Killers of the Flower Moon, which is a chilling true crime history about the Osage murders, later adapted into major film, directed by Martin Scorsese. And then The Wager, which we're covering today, came out in 2023, so it's fairly new, about 3 years actually. Happy New Year. And then we've also got The White Darkness, which is a psychological portrait of obsession set against the backdrop of Antarctic exploration. Now, Grann's writing style and themes consistently explore survival under extreme conditions, moral gray areas, especially who controls the narrative of truth. He talks about power, leadership, and betrayal, and the thin line between heroism and villainy. And The Wager, these themes converge as Grann reconstructs a true 18th century naval disaster, showing how history itself becomes a battleground, not just over facts, but over reputation and legacy. So the reputation impact of this book is that Grann is widely regarded as one of the leading narrative nonfiction writers of his generation. His books frequently appear on the best of year lists and are praised for making history feel urgent, human, and unsettlingly relevant. He has a rare talent for asking a central question in every story. Who gets to decide what really happened? And with The Wager, Grann is operating at the intersection of archival obsession, so he goes into court transcripts, ship logs, journals, and moral ambiguity. So like there's no real clean heroes in this, and there's no simple villains. And they talked about narrative power, so how truth is constructed after the fact. And this book feels motivated by modern anxiety. If two detailed, confident stories contradict each other, how do we decide on what's true? In an era of contested facts, Grann uses an 18th century shipwreck as a case study into epistemology and how truth survives stress. Now, I want to talk about the historical context of The Wager. So The Wager is rooted in the brutal realities of 18th century imperial warfare, naval life, and global competition. So this is an era when survival at sea was as uncertain as empires fighting over it. This was during the age of empire and global conflict, so the 1740s. Now, the story takes place during the War of Jenkins' Year, 1739 to 1748, a conflict between Britain and Spain sparked by trade disputes and imperial ambition in the Americas. Britain sought to weaken Spain's dominance over South American trade routes and treasure fleets, so sending naval squadrons across the globe to disrupt Spanish power was part of that war. And The Wager was part of a Commodore George Anson's circumnavigation, which was a daring mission to attack Spanish holdings in the Pacific, an area Britain barely understood but desperately wanted to control. Now, life in the 18th century Royal Navy was pretty brutal. Sailors aboard ships like The Wager faced conditions that bordered on inhumane. There was forced enlistment, so there's a concept called press gangs where these gangs would go out and force people off the street to enlist, and diets were nutritionally deficient, leading to scurvy, disease, and mass death. And discipline was harsh, enforced by flogging and execution. And officers were drawn from the gentry, so sailors from the poor, so creating sharp class divisions. And these realities set the stage for the book's central conflict. When authority collapses, does rank still matter? And in this story, they go around the Cape Horn, which is known for the world's deadliest passage. Now, to reach the Pacific, Anson's fleet had around Cape Horn, which was notorious for unpredictable storms, freezing temperatures, treacherous currents, and near constant ship damage. And most ships in the expedition were crippled or lost before ever encountering the enemy. And The Wager became separated, wrecking off the coast of present-day Chile in 1741, triggering the survival ordeal at the heart of the book. Now, in 18th century Britain, naval officers weren't just judged by survival, but by honor, obedience, and narrative control. So court-martials were public, political events, and reputation could mean fortune or ruin. In this context, explains why The Wager is not only a survival story, but also a battle over who tells history, whose testimony is believed, and whether survival can be a crime. So why does this context matter? It helps us understand the era that reveals the deeper tension in The Wager. This is a story born from an age that valued empire over human life, order over compassion, and rank over reality, until those values were tested at the edge of the world. Let's talk about key themes and deeper questions. So, truth versus narrative. If you had a nickel for every time I said this, but the central question isn't what happened, but whose version wins and why. Truth becomes less about facts and more about credibility, power, and timing. Survival doesn't just determine who lives, it determines who gets to tell the story. Next, authority under extreme conditions. Naval hierarchies work at sea until they don't. And the book probes, when does obedience become immoral? When does rebellion become necessary? And is authority legitimate if it ensures survival at the cost of humanity? Next theme. Civilization is thinner than we think. The men don't gradually become savages. They revert frighteningly fast. Law, honor, and duty prove fragile when food disappears. And the book quietly argues that civilization is not a given. It's a temporary agreement. Next, memory, self-justification, and moral accounting. Years later, survivors reinterpret their actions. Grann shows how memory reshapes guilt into logic, cruelty into necessity, and cowardice into prudence. Now, there's some major symbolism in this story and recurring motifs. The shipwreck. This isn't just a physical destruction. It's a collapse of imperial confidence, moral certainty, and institutional control. The wreck marks the moment when rules stop being enforced externally and must be justified internally. Hunger. Hunger just isn't biological, it's moral. As starvation deepens, ethical frameworks begin to shrink. And the men don't just ask, is this right? But can I really survive this? Now, journals, logs, and testimony, symbolically, here are the written records that just become weapons, or that become weapons. Whoever controls the narrative controls judgment. So the act of writing is an act of power. Last of all, we got the trial. The court-martial is civilization's attempt to reassert order after chaos, but it's too clean and too late. And law struggles to judge actions taken beyond law's reach. Now, before concluding, I want to give you some notable quotes that are worth underlining. And some of these aren't being paraphrased, but the line between discipline and cruelty was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Why does this matter? This captures the book's central tension. Authority isn't inherently moral just because it's structural. Now, survival did not clarify the truth, it complicated it. Why does this matter? Because we assume surviving grants wisdom. Grant suggests it often grants leverage instead. So why does this book still matter? This book feels eerily modern because it speaks to competing truths in media and politics, institutional self-preservation, and how narratives harden before facts do. In a world where credibility often outweighs accuracy, The Wager reminds us that history is frequently decided not by what happened, by who sounds most convincing when order is restored. It also offers a humbling insight to almost anyone under enough pressure. It removes oversight, and the moral compass starts spinning. So some discussion prompts I'd like to give you for anyone that's doing this for book club are: is mutiny ever morally justified? What does the book suggest about rebellion under unjust authority? If two truths feel equally coherent, how should institutions decide? And what does the book imply about leadership in crisis? And who do you trust more, the survivor who endured the worst, or the leader who tried to maintain order, and why? In closing, The Wager isn't ultimately about a ship lost at sea. It's about what happens after, when chaos ends. Stories begin, and truth must survive judgment. Good. Now, I appreciate everyone listening to this. And don't forget, the best parts, as always, are between the lines. Please give us a follow on social media and on wherever you get your podcast from. Appreciate you. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.